Welcome to Chapter 3. As you can see, it's referring to supply chain organization. So we're going to talk about what the objectives of supply are and how it needs to be organized, and what are some of the activities and responsibilities. So I've always described it this way: getting the right item at the right time in the right quantity. And as you can see, there has to be quality requirements, which is not easy to define sometimes, even determining what the right materials are. And so it's not just as simple as you and I going to the store and picking out milk. Well, what kind of milk? There's so many choices these days. When are the due dates? For perishable items, things along that line. You also need it delivered at the right time and to the right place. I'm sure there's been many products that have been delivered to the wrong place. I've had that happen myself, and I'm sure you have too. Whether your neighbor got your product. I had that happen recently where something was delivered to my neighbor and the person dropping it off misread or whatever, or you get the wrong mail in your mailbox. It needs to be from the right source. We talked about suppliers last week, and the right level of service. So before and after the sale, after sale service has become a bigger and bigger component of supplying or being a supplier. And so toll-free numbers, online chat, things along that line. A lot of times businesses that are heavily service-based, like Questrade, gets very high ratings because of their excellent customer service. And of course, price. So a lot of time is focused on price, but that is not the case. And a lot of times people think it's the lowest price, it's the right price, because you can underpay for something. We all pay extra compared to the bare minimum for items. We don't always go with the cheapest pair of socks or runners or whatever the case should be. So here's some of the goals. Improve your competitive position even. Yeah. And uninterrupted flow of materials. We talked about that during last week's class, where you need your steady supply of materials. Otherwise, your plant can shut down. You need to keep a certain amount of inventory, and your losses through poor quality or returns or things along that line. There were some companies, when I worked for London Drugs, their quality was so poor and we had so many customers bringing product back. Yes, we had big profit margins on it, but customers blamed the retailer. Even though we didn't make it, we just put it on the shelf and sold it. So this company's product gave us great profit margins, but the amount of returns was very high. Again, quality and perhaps, not always, best-in-class suppliers. Standardization of products, and we talked about, last week we talked about reducing the number of suppliers. There's been a major shift in the automotive industry in the last 20 years for standardizing items to using common components. In Toyota, the 6-cylinder engine that goes in their Camry also goes in their 4Runner and their Highlander and the Sienna van, and even a modified version, but it goes in the Lexus ES, whatever number it is these days, but their entry-level sedan. And at one point, it also went in the RAV4. So they use it extensively. I believe in the Tundra truck. So they use the same components and economies of scale. Plus, rather than having, like we talked last week about 3,000 suppliers, we could have 3,000 parts. You achieve economies of scale, and now you only have 1,500 parts. And you may be surprised at how many parts even go into an engine. At one time, it was 800 parts for an engine, and then Toyota came out with a new engine. It was, I can't remember whether it was reduced by 500 or reduced by 500, but it was a lot less parts. All right, and again, purchasing lowest total cost of ownership, which also includes returns, waste. You might buy something that's fairly inexpensive, but it has a lot of waste. We need to have productive internal relationships and lower operating costs. So you might buy something that's less expensive, but you use a lot more of it, like a cheap oil or something along that line. All right. So here's an organizational structure where you will have buyers or purchasing agents, as they're often called these days. And we talked last week about how you would structure that in the case that we had, whether it should be by unit area, or I think there was somewhat of a general agreement, or there was a consideration anyways for breaking it down by the type of product. All right. Again, we've talked about centralized and decentralized last week. And of course, a hybrid is just kind of in between. And over my many years of working, I've seen organizations shift that back and forth. And even after all these years, I'm not sure which is better, centralized or decentralized. There's pluses and minuses to each other. There just seems to be, honestly, the whim of the bias, rather than whim, but the bias of whoever the say VP is, and perhaps even the president, whoever she or he is. Right. And again, I'm not going to go through each one of these in detail. That would be really tedious. Advantages and disadvantages, paying for some advantages, ability to pay for talent. So get some of the better people. Specialization is also an advantage. And also line reporting, who reports to whom. I know that at SAIT, one of the things they have done, centralized IT, used to be very decentralized, and a lot of the employees who are centralized now really dislike it. They like the autonomy that they had before and the level of service that we get, because there was also cutbacks of, I believe 2 years ago, it was about 18 IT people were let go. And so in this particular case, there was also a tremendous reduction in service. I went from getting personalized service, where they'd actually come to your office, to being sent YouTube videos. Here, this is how you do it. Really? That's terrible. All right. But it's not the people's fault. It's the fact that they don't have enough staff, and the service level went down dramatically. And some of the disadvantages, there can appear to be excess staff, because if you've only got one person in one area, and then that person goes on vacation, maybe you need two, but you don't need two all the time. Things along that line. You tend to have these silos where you have interdepartmental barriers. They may not talk to each other as much, so one area knows something where the other area doesn't. Say, again, especially with IT, constantly having to know what the latest patches and updates and things along that line are. Again, a long list of advantages and disadvantages. I'm sure that we're going to talk about it in the upcoming weeks worth of classes about this with the case, but it's extensive. And as I mentioned earlier, at least personally speaking, I don't know which one is better. There's advantages and disadvantages. My bias is towards decentralized, because I do believe it provides a higher level of service, or it can if you've got really good people in that area, which has been my experience. Very fortunate to have some very talented people. And again, a hybrid structure. So, and again, with speaking specifically of purchasing though, very centralized place. Again, you can share resources. When somebody goes on vacation, somebody else can cover, whereas decentralized, it's harder to do that. But these days too, you don't have to even physically co-locate them. You can do that in a virtual setting, so that people can, with whether it be Zoom meetings or whatever way they can meet. But it's still not quite the same as the hallway conversations. All right. again, 4 areas of specialization: commodities, materials management, administration, and supply research, which we'll talk about. Here are some of the chief purchasing officers, which I've never really worked for a place that has specifically had a CPO. And there certainly could be the manager of the purchasing or supply area. You can see that there is an increase in educational levels, as there is in supply chain in general. There's been a major push to have people work in supply chain who just didn't fall into the jobs, who actually have training and experience with inventory management, in this case, materials management, and walk out of school with a much higher level of understanding of how supply chain interacts, logistics, materials management, planning, scheduling, on and on. All right. Again, the most common reporting relationships you can see. Influence, a lot of it can depend on the amount of materials. When I worked in psychiatry, our non-labor costs were 8%. 92% of our costs were labor, and 8% was non-labor. That's everything. And so that would be a very small area. We certainly wouldn't have needed somebody. Occasionally we needed to buy materials or equipment, and we'll definitely talk about capital equipment later in the course, but just regular materials that we would get from our stores area, like pen and paper and things like that, when we used to use pens and paper, or capital equipment such as computer purchases. All right, and you need to identify what is acquired, or some of the activities that need to be involved, professionals for determining what actual items need to be purchased. So here's again the purchasing and the buying decision. Research, especially if the item is a capital good where it's more complex, and so the buyer may not know. He or she will be told from, say, the engineer or engineers or whomever, the IT people, on and on, the medical people when I worked in the healthcare field. Controlling inventory, making sure you have the right amount. Zero inventory, you've probably heard, but zero inventory doesn't mean zero, like the number zero. What it means is just the right amount, not too much and not too little. Again, when I worked in the healthcare field, if we ran out of a med, people could die. So it was pretty serious stuff. And if we had too much of something, it could go bad. You know, like what we're seeing with the pandemic and the shipments of the doses of the vaccine. A lot of emphasis on inventory control. There was even a case in the United States where somebody deliberately sabotaged some of the vaccine, which is a very fortunately, a very unusual event. The transportation of the items, again, with the vaccine, some of it requires super cold storage at, I believe, minus 70 degrees Celsius. And again, your forecasting and your planning that you have, how much you're going to need, when are you going to need it, MRP, things along that line. Do you outsource it? Do you subcontract it? Do you do it yourself? So this course that I'm teaching for U of C, they are subcontracting it. I am a contractor. I am not a full-time faculty at U of C. And so they needed somebody to teach this course, and so you're stuck with me. All right, just kidding. Hopefully you don't feel that way. All right. Cross-functional teams, especially if you have something that's more complex, even regularly ordered items, you may need to get input because items change. You know, some of the things that we used to purchase are you no longer buy, or there's been a shift. So you have to be careful, especially with today's evolving world in technology. I was watching a TV show the other day, and this person didn't know what a floppy disk was. And I remember the first time I saw a floppy disk, which was the 5 1/4 disc, which was very floppy. And then I saw the 3.5 inch disc. For those of you old enough to remember this, I thought it was a hard drive. All right. I didn't know that it wasn't, that it was a floppy disk, but it didn't flop. Okay. So laugh all you want, okay? Again, teaming with your suppliers, teaming with your customers, etc. Supplier councils. Key success factors: you need to be supportive, have some structure, and measurable goals. Key performance indicators, KPIs. That is something that I know my students who work for Amazon have said, that they're constantly checking their KPIs. Like, we're not talking like twice a day, we're talking 10, 12 times a day. They're constantly on their devices checking where their KPIs are so they can manage things in real time. All right. Again, having the right people with the right qualifications. There was an organization called PMAC, Purchasing Management Association of Canada. They several years ago changed their name to SCMA, Supply Chain Management Association, and they offer certificates and in supply chain, where they have courses that you can take and become a certified buyer. And I remember years ago taking a course, and I became actually earned a credit with them with taxes, because I worked in the tax department. So that would also, by the way, be part of the purchasing. We used to go through, and if we pay taxes on something we shouldn't have, we claimed it back. And and then we had 3 jurisdictions, because my company that I worked for was on the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border. So we had Manitoba sales tax, we had Saskatchewan sales tax, we had federal tax and different types of federal tax. This is a long time ago, before GST and things along that line. And so, and one of the big things of GST that wasn't talked about a lot when it was implemented was the harmonization. So we used to have items. I'll give you an example: paint. If we bought it, paint, and we used it on the Manitoba side, we pay taxes on it. If we used it on a Saskatchewan side and we used it because we used to paint areas of rock and blow it up, Saskatchewan said, you don't have to pay tax on it. It's called a consumable. If we used the same can of paint on a building, it was 5%. And if we used it on a piece of equipment, it was 9%. So the same item, I learned very quickly, it wasn't the item, it was what the usage was. So on the same paint, we had 4 different tax possibilities. So we had to track province, and we also had to track was it building, was it equipment, or things along this line. So again, these are some of the dedication and performance to implement the decisions. All right. Team leader, not too different from any other team leader. Establish goals and commit to those performance goals or those KPIs. Make sure that individual members are on board. Managing conflict, which is actually a course I'm teaching this term, which is really rather interesting, about conflict resolution. Again, providing focus. Again, preventing team domination by a member. I've seen that. I see that sometimes in a class, and there's nothing wrong with the students doing. They're just participating a great deal. And the way that I deal with it is, if I get somebody who's dominating in that way, then I'll just say, okay, especially if it's in a physical classroom, I'll say, okay, somebody from this half of the class, or somebody from, here. I did have a situation a couple of years ago where I was not really the team leader, and I had a really dominant person on a particular team, and it was really frustrating for the team. Eventually that person was banned. They were just incredibly disruptive to the functioning of the team. And they eventually had to, it was a school thing, so they were eventually banned from participating in those school projects from there on. But it was a miserable experience for everybody. All right, making sure that team members' roles are clearly defined. You hear this even in sports. I know what's expected of me, so maybe my role will change from an offensive role to a defensive role, or get a great deal of pride in shutting down the other team's star player. So it's not always about, say, offensive statistics, as opposed to my goal is to stop the puck, or my goal is to put the puck in the other team's net. All right. Collaborative with a consortia, with a group of purchasing people, and collaborative purchasing. So you have different areas, say, of government will go together so they can get better prices on, again, pens, paper, whatever that they need. A computer, like USB sticks these days, things along this line. Again, we want to reduce the total costs. We get lower prices. We can get better quality and better service because we have more power in that way. I know that different schools I teach at, one of the schools I teach at is, or has taught at in the past, is Great Lakes College out of Slave Lake. And they don't have a lot of influence with the publishers. So if the publisher and the book reps, because the volumes are very high, say it's SAIT or Mount Royal or U of C. So Slave Lake, or like I said, oh, sorry, I said Great Lakes, I meant Northern Lakes College out of Slave Lake. They don't have the same kind of influence when it comes to particular textbooks. They don't get the same level of service. And again, here's some more keys. Sharing of risks, sharing of costs can be spread out. It's like insurance. High degrees of trust and professionalism. And that's the end of chapter number 3. So I hope you enjoyed my little presentation. We'll see you in class.